There's something chilling about the power of a whisper in the dark, the way a single rumor, passed from one trembling voice to another, can grow into an unstoppable force. Picture this, the flicker of torchlight on a town crier's face as he steps into the square long after curfew, his voice cutting through the silence to deliver news that wasn't meant for daylight. These weren't just announcements, they were sparks thrown into the tinder of empires, and history shows us, again and again, how easily those sparks could ignite revolutions, topple crowns, and rewrite the map of the world. Tonight, we're stepping into the shadows to uncover 21 nights when the simple act of spreading a rumor didn't just change the game, it ended it. Think about the last time you heard a piece of gossip, something so juicy, so shocking, you couldn't help but share it. Now imagine that same ripple effect, but with kingdoms hanging in the balance. In the medieval world, where news traveled at the speed of a horse's gallop, town criers weren't just messengers, they were the original social media influencers. Their words could rally armies or send cities into panic. And when those words were lies, that's when history took its sharpest turns. From the hushed warnings that sealed the fate of Constantinople to the midnight proclamations that fractured the Holy Roman Empire, these were moments when truth and deception danced too close and empires paid the price. What's truly fascinating isn't just the scale of these collapses, but how fragile the threads of power really were. A well-timed rumor about a king's death, a whispered betrayal among allies, or even a staged cry of alarm could unravel decades of stability in a single night. These stories aren't just about the past, they're a mirror held up to our own world, where information and misinformation still shapes empires, just in different forms. So as we walk through these 21 nights together, listen closely, because the echoes of those medieval whispers, they're still with us today. To understand how rumors could topple kingdoms, we first need to grasp the immense trust placed in town criers. These weren't just random messengers, they were living institutions, appointed by kings and councils, their voices carrying the full weight of authority. Dressed in vibrant robes emblazoned with royal insignia, they stood on wooden platforms, their bells cutting through the noise of daily life. When a crier spoke, people stopped. They listened because in an age before newspapers or printing presses, these men, and sometimes women, were the only link between rulers and the ruled. But here's the twist, that very trust made them dangerous. A town crier didn't just report news, they performed it. The way they paused before delivering a grave announcement, the dramatic lift of an eyebrow when sharing a scandal. These subtle choices could turn a simple update into a sensation. And in the right hands or the wrong ones, that power became a weapon. Take the infamous Night of the Crimson Bells in 14th century Paris, when a crier's offhand remark about the king's failing health sent merchants hoarding grain within hours. By dawn, the streets were in chaos, and the crown had to dispatch armed guards to debunk the lie. What's often overlooked is how these criers operated in a world without fact-checking. No one demanded sources or proof. If the messenger wore the right colors and rang the right bell, their words became truth by default. And that's why the most devastating rumors often started with just 3 chilling words, by order of. Because once those phrases left a crier's lips, the message carried the illusion of legitimacy, whether it came from a throne room or a shadowed alley. This blind trust in the office, not the truth behind it, set the stage for history's most explosive deceptions. Consider the logistics too. These criers worked precise routes, hitting villages on market days when crowds were largest. A lie planted in one town could spread like wildfire along trade routes, mutating with each retelling. By the time the original crier returned to their post, the rumor they'd seeded might have grown horns and wings far beyond anyone's control. That's how a single evening's announcement in Nuremberg about disputed succession could become, by the next full moon, a confirmed story of regicide that fractured alliances across the Holy Roman Empire. Their influence even shaped language itself. The phrase, "Don't shoot the messenger," traces back to this era because while criers were protected by law, furious crowds often forgot that distinction when hearing news of taxes or conscription. Yet, ironically, it was that same legal protection that made them ideal rumor mongers, after all, who would dare punish a voice merely repeating what they'd heard. This delicate dance between authority and anonymity turned town criers into the perfect storm, respected enough to be believed, yet detached enough to deny culpability when lies unraveled. So as we step into our first story of empire-toppling whispers, remember, these weren't random lies shouted into the void. They were precision strikes delivered by the very people societies trusted to tell them the truth. And that betrayal of trust, that lethal gap between expectation and reality, is what made the fall so devastating every single time. The air over Constantinople hung thick with smoke and desperation on that final night in May of 1453. For weeks, the Ottomans had bombarded the mighty Theodosian walls, but it wasn't cannon fire that ultimately cracked the city's defenses. It was a whisper. As lanterns flickered in the narrow streets, a town crier's voice sliced through the darkness, repeating a claim that slithered like a dagger between the ribs of the Byzantine ranks. Generals plot with the Sultan. The gates will swing open by dawn. Never mind that the story was pure fabrication. In the fog of war, where fear outruns reason, the rumor didn't need proof. It needed only enough traction to paralyze. What makes this night so haunting is how perfectly it exploited the psychology of a siege. Cut off from reinforcements, low on supplies, and surrounded by the enemy, Constantinople's defenders were already clinging to hope by their fingertips. The rumor didn't just sow doubt, it weaponized the isolation they all felt. Soldiers who'd stood shoulder to shoulder for months suddenly eyed each other with suspicion. Officers found their orders met with hesitation, as if every command might be part of some hidden treachery. The Ottomans didn't need to bribe anyone. The mere suggestion of betrayal did their work for them. And the timing, impeccable. The crier's cry came just hours before Mehmed II's final assault. As defenders wasted precious energy questioning loyalties, the Ottomans massed for their decisive push. When the attack came at first light, key sections of the wall were undermanned not because men had fled, but because coordination had collapsed. The breach wasn't just physical, it was a fracture in trust, and that's what made it unstoppable. By noon, the double-headed eagle banner of Byzantium lay trampled in the dirt, and 8 centuries of empire evaporated like morning dew. What's often missed in this story is the crier's identity. Was he an Ottoman plant, a Byzantine drunkard paid to spread chaos, or just some poor fool repeating gossip he'd overheard? We'll never know, but that ambiguity is the point. Unlike a spy or a traitor whose actions leave evidence, a rumor dissolves into the air, untraceable and deniable. The real power wasn't in who told the lie, but in how eagerly a desperate city chose to believe it. This night also reveals a brutal truth about power. Legitimacy is a story, and stories can be rewritten mid-sentence. For generations, Byzantium's rulers had leaned on divine right and ancient tradition to command obedience. But in those final hours, a single counter-narrative unverified, absurdly simple, undid all of it. The lesson echoed far beyond Constantinople. The moment people stop believing in the system stops functioning. Walls don't defend cities, faith does, and faith, as the Ottomans proved, is fragile as a spider's web. Now, fast forward 3 centuries to a snowy evening in Prague, where another empire would crumble to the same tactic. But this time, the rumor wouldn't target generals, it would strike at the very heart of a royal bloodline, proving that even the Holy Roman Empire wasn't holy, Roman, or immune to the poison of a well-placed lie. The snow crunched underfoot as the town crier of Canossa climbed the steps of the church square that January night in 1077, his breath visible in the freezing air. What he shouted into the darkness would send shockwaves through Christendom, a claim that Pope Gregory VII had not only excommunicated Emperor Henry IV, but had stripped him of his crown entirely. The truth was more complicated, but in the medieval world, perception often outweighed papal decrees. By morning, the rumor had spread like frost across the empire, reaching the ears of Henry's already restless nobles. Their response, to abandon him en masse, leaving the emperor with no choice but to endure 3 barefoot days in the snow outside Canossa Castle, begging the Pope's forgiveness in one of history's most humiliating acts of penance. What's extraordinary about this night isn't just the spectacle of a ruler brought low, it's how perfectly the rumor exploited the fragile balance between church and state. Medieval Europe operated on a knife's edge of mutual dependence. Kings needed papal blessing to rule, and popes needed royal swords to enforce their will. The Criers' declaration didn't just accuse Henry of sin, it framed him as spiritually toxic, a leader whose very touch could damn those who followed him. For nobles already chafing under imperial taxes or territorial disputes, this wasn't just gossip, it was divine permission to rebel. The genius of the lie lay in its half-truth. Gregory had indeed threatened excommunication, but the full stripping of royal authority, that was exaggeration turned into wildfire. Yet in an age where news traveled slower than suspicion, nuance evaporated. By the time Henry reached Canossa to negotiate, the rumor had done its work. Regional lords had seized the moment to reclaim autonomy, fracturing the empire's unity beyond repair. The Holy Roman Empire would limp on for centuries, but never again with the same centralized power. A single winter's whisper had redefined the map of Europe. This night also reveals a darker truth about medieval politics: the power of plausible deniability. No record suggests the Pope ordered the Criers' announcement. More likely, it was the work of local bishops or rival nobles exploiting the chaos. But unlike an outright rebellion which leaves clear culprits, a rumor floats in the realm of who said it first. By the time Henry realized the scale of the deception, the damage was irreversible. His barefoot humiliation wasn't just personal. It became a symbol of imperial weakness that emboldened every minor lord with ambitions of independence. Fast forward 2 centuries, and you'll find the same playbook in use during the Crusades, but this time, the rumor wouldn't pit emperor against pope. It would turn brother knights against each other in a bloodbath that reshaped the fate of Jerusalem. And like the night in Canossa, it would prove that in the Game of Thrones, sometimes the deadliest weapons aren't swords, but sentences left hanging in the cold night air. The walls of Antioch groaned under the weight of starvation that summer night in 1098. Inside the Crusader camp, men gnawed on boiled leather and whispered about betrayal until a town crier's voice shattered the uneasy silence. "The nobles feast while you starve," he cried, pointing toward the commander's tents. Barrels of grain hidden from honest men. The accusation was fiction, but in the belly of a siege, hunger sharpens ears to hear any promise of food. Within hours, Frankish knights turned on their own, blades drawn over empty cookpots. The real miracle isn't that the Crusaders eventually took Antioch, it's that their alliance survived the night at all. What makes this betrayal so insidious is how it preyed on a very real crisis. The Crusaders were starving. After months encamped outside Antioch's walls, supplies had dwindled to nothing. But the Criers' lie twisted desperation into something far more dangerous, the conviction that suffering wasn't shared equally. When soldiers stormed their leaders' quarters, they found no hoarded grain, just hollow-cheeked nobles rationing the same moldy bread. Yet the damage was done. The rumor had exposed fault lines between rival factions, proving that even holy war couldn't erase old rivalries between Normans, Provençals, and Flemish knights. The aftermath reveals a brutal lesson about military cohesion. Antioch fell not because of the rumor itself, but because the lie lingered like a toxin in the ranks. Months later, when Crusader forces marched toward Jerusalem, commanders hesitated to consolidate troops, fearing another outburst of infighting. Supply trains moved slower as officers triple-checked distributions to avoid accusations of favoritism. The rumor hadn't just caused a riot, it had rewired the campaign's nervous system, replacing trust with bureaucratic paralysis. Historians still debate who planted the lie. Some blame Byzantine spies hoping to weaken Western rivals. Others point to disgruntled soldiers exploiting the chaos. But the Crier's identity matters less than his strategy. By framing greed as a collective sin of the leadership class, he turned individual hunger into a crusade within the crusade. This wasn't just misinformation. It was class warfare disguised as revelation, a tactic that would echo through every peasant revolt from the Jacquerie to Wat Tyler's rebellion. Now shift your gaze westward to 1520 Castile, where a different kind of hunger for gold, not bread, would turn a rumor into revolt. There, a crier's casual remark about hidden Aztec treasures would ignite the Communero Uprising, proving that even the glint of imagined wealth could make empires tremble. The streets of Toledo burned with more than summer heat on that July night in 1520. A town crier's voice cut through the chaos, repeating a claim that spread through Castile like wildfire. The king's ships sail heavy with our gold, bound not for Rome but for Germany. The accusation was explosive because it played on two simmering fears: that young Charles I cared more for his Habsburg inheritance than his Spanish subjects, and that Castile's wealth was being looted to fund foreign wars. Within days, what began as grumbling in taverns became full-scale revolt. Nobles and peasants, typically at each other's throats, now standing shoulder to shoulder against the crown. What made this rumor so potent wasn't just its economic sting, but its brilliant timing. Charles had only recently left Spain to be crowned Holy Roman Emperor, appointing foreign advisors to govern in his absence. The crier's cry didn't invent resentment. It gave voice to suspicions already whispering through the markets and wheat fields. And by framing the theft as a betrayal of Spanish treasure, not just royal coffers, it transformed abstract discontent into a visceral, shared outrage. Farmers who'd never met a German suddenly saw their harvest taxes funding some distant duke's army. Nobles who'd tolerated Habsburg rule now questioned whether their king was even Spanish at all. The Communero Revolt's brutality revealed another layer of rumor's power, its ability to rewrite identities overnight. As rebels stormed tax offices and burned records, they weren't just attacking symbols of oppression, they were erasing the paper trail that connected Castile to the broader empire. Every ledger tossed into the flames made the idea of an independent Spain feel more possible. And that's the true danger of economic rumors. They don't just anger people, they rewire their sense of what's theirs. When the crier spoke of stolen gold, he wasn't describing theft, he was defining it, drawing a line between us and them that hadn't existed so sharply before. Yet for all its fury, the revolt collapsed within a year. Charles returned with troops, executing ringleaders and restoring order, but the scars remained. The crown never again trusted Castilian towns to govern themselves, tightening control in ways that fueled resentment for generations. And that's the irony. The rumor about stolen gold became a self-fulfilling prophecy. By convincing Spaniards their wealth was being pillaged, it pushed them to rebel, which forced the crown to squeeze them harder to pay for the suppression. The lie didn't just mirror reality, it manufactured it. Now, cross the Pyrenees and fast forward 66 years to a very different court, where a queen's fate wouldn't hinge on gold, but on something far more sinister, a whisper that she'd enchanted the king himself. Because in Tudor England, the right rumor could turn even a monarch's bedchamber into a battleground. The torches lining the Thames flickered ominously as the town crier's voice pierced the midnight silence on that fateful April night in 1536. By order of His Majesty's Council, he declared, "The Queen stands accused of witchcraft, treason, and conspiracy against the crown." The words hung in the air like poison, seeping into the ears of Londoners who'd once cheered Anne Boleyn's coronation. What made this rumor so lethal wasn't its absurdity. It was how perfectly it tapped into the fears of a society where a woman's ambition could easily be reframed as dark magic. Anne's downfall wasn't just about Henry VIII's fickle heart. It was a masterclass in how rumors weaponize existing biases. The crier didn't need to invent stories of Anne bewitching the king. He simply amplified whispers already circulating among courtiers jealous of her influence. Tales of her sixth finger, a supposed witch's mark, or her alleged affairs with court musicians gained traction not because they were credible, but because they confirmed what many already suspected, that a woman who'd risen from lady-in-waiting to queen must have used unnatural means. The rumor's genius lay in its timing, with Henry desperate for a male heir and Anne delivering only a daughter. The crier's proclamation gave the king both an excuse and public cover to dismantle his marriage. But the real damage unfolded in the weeks that followed. As the rumor spread, it mutated like a virus. What began as accusations of adultery spiraled into claims of plots to murder Henry, even whispers that Anne had poisoned his first wife, Catherine of Aragon. Each retelling made the story more grotesque and more believable. By the time Anne stood trial, the public had been so thoroughly conditioned that her guilt seemed inevitable. The court's verdict was merely a formality. The true sentence had been passed in the court of public opinion, fueled by that single night's announcement. This night also exposes the darker mechanics of royal propaganda. The crier's words weren't just gossip, they were the opening move in a calculated campaign. Within days, playwrights were paid to pen satires about Anne's crimes, while pamphlets circulated with lurid illustrations of her alleged misdeeds. The rumor didn't just accuse, it saturated the cultural landscape until fiction drowned out fact. Even Anne's eloquent final speech from the scaffold couldn't compete with the narrative now etched into public memory. Yet the most chilling lesson lies in the aftermath. Anne's execution didn't end the rumors, it validated them. Her death became proof of their truth, setting a precedent that would haunt Henry's later wives. Once a ruler discovers how easily a crier's lie can rewrite reality, the temptation to use that tool becomes irresistible. Just 3 years later, another late-night proclamation would accuse Anne of Cleves of hiding a secret deformity, giving Henry grounds to annul their marriage. The playbook had been established, first the whisper, then the stamp of officialdom, finally the irreversible consequence. Now, turn the clock back 5 centuries to a very different empire, where a rumor about something as mundane as tax collection would trigger death spirals far beyond anything Henry could imagine. Because in Byzantium, the right lie didn't just topple queens, it could bankrupt emperors. The streets of Constantinople reeked of death and desperation in the summer of 541. The plague of Justinian had already claimed thousands, leaving bodies stacked like firewood in the alleys. Then, just as the city teetered on the edge of collapse, a town crier's voice rang out near the hippodrome with news that shattered what little stability remained. The emperor is dead. The throne lies empty. The declaration spread faster than the disease itself. By nightfall, mobs were smashing merchant stalls near the Mies, convinced law had died with the emperor. Only one problem: Justinian wasn't just alive. He was watching the chaos unfold from his palace windows. This wasn't just a case of mistaken identity. The rumor exploited the perfect storm of circumstances. With the plague decimating the city, normal channels of communication had broken down. Officials who might have corrected the lie were either dead or barricaded in their homes. And in that vacuum of authority, the crier's words became gospel. What makes this night so revealing is how it mirrored the empire's physical collapse in microcosm, systems failing, trust eroding, and desperation overriding reason. The looters weren't just stealing silks and spices. They were acting out the unthinkable, a world without order. Justinian's response became legendary. At dawn, he staged a theatrical walk along the city walls, visible to all, his purple robes deliberately vivid against the grim backdrop. The sight alone quelled the riots. But the damage ran deeper. The episode exposed a brutal truth. An empire's strength depends less on its armies than on the belief in its continuity. Once people assumed the throne was empty, they acted as if it were, even when the reality proved otherwise. The psychological wound never fully healed. Years later, Procopius would write that the emperor's near-mythic reputation for resilience began that night. But so did the whispers questioning whether any ruler could truly control a city at the mercy of rats and rumors. Historians still debate whether the crier acted alone or as part of a plot. The timing suggests malice. The rumor emerged just as Justinian's tax collectors prepared to inventory plague emptied properties for seizure. But the deeper lesson lies in how health crises transform misinformation. In normal times, a death rumor might prompt cautious inquiries amid pestilence. It triggers primal survival instincts. The same panic that made people avoid sick neighbors now made them believe the unimaginable. When survival feels uncertain, people stop demanding proof. They act first and ask questions never. Now fast forward 7 centuries to the steppes of Eurasia, where a different kind of plague, political, not bacterial, would spread through the Mongol Empire. Because sometimes the deadliest contagion isn't carried by fleas. It's carried by the human voice, repeating words designed to divide. And in the case of Genghis Khan's successors, it wouldn't take a pandemic to make an empire collapse. Just a well-placed lie about who really deserved to wear the horsehair crown. The wind howling across the Mongolian steppe carried more than just dust on that autumn night in 1259. It carried a secret that would unravel an empire. In the flickering torchlight of Karakorum's central square, a town crier's voice cracked as he delivered news meant only for the ears of generals. The great Khan Mönch rides no more. The words were carefully vague, but their implication was clear. By dawn, the whisper had mutated into a shout: the Khan is dead. Even as Mönch himself still breathed, weakened by dysentery but very much alive. That gap between rumor and reality became the fault line that split the Mongol Empire in two. What made this night so catastrophic wasn't just the lie itself, but how it exploited the Mongols' most sacred rule. Succession must be decided by Kurultai, the Grand Council of Khans. By preemptively declaring Mönch's death, the rumor forced rival factions to act before consensus could be reached. His brothers, Kublai and Arik Berk, began marshalling troops within hours, each convinced the other sought to steal the throne. When Mönch did succumb weeks later, the empire was already divided, with bloodlines and loyalties hardening into battle lines. The Kurultai became a farce. Two separate councils held a continent apart, each crowning their own ruler. The brilliance of the deception lay in its plausibility. Mönch had been campaigning in distant Sichuan when he fell ill, leaving Karakorum buzzing with uncertainty. The Criers' announcement didn't invent doubt. It weaponized the natural anxiety of a realm too vast to govern without absolute confidence in its leader. And in that moment of hesitation, the machinery of imperial administration ground to a halt. Tax collectors paused their rounds, fearing allegiances might shift. Messengers delayed dispatches, unsure which court to address. The rumor didn't just predict chaos, it created it. Historians still argue whether the crier acted alone or as a pawn in someone's scheme. But the aftermath speaks for itself. The Mongol civil war that followed wasn't merely a power struggle, it was the unmaking of a political philosophy. Genghis Khan's vision of unity under one sky shattered into rival khanates. The Yuan dynasty in the east, the Golden Horde in the west. Trade routes that had flourished under the Pax Mongolica withered as suspicion replaced trust. And all because one night's whisper convinced ambitious men they couldn't afford to wait for truth. Now, shift your gaze westward to 1337, where a very different kind of rumor, not about death but taxes, would light the fuse for a conflict lasting 100 years. Because when a Flemish crier declared the English crown had secretly raised the wool tariff, he wasn't just spreading news, he was handing France the perfect casus belli. The fields outside Paris lay trampled underfoot that sweltering June night in 1358, the air thick with the stench of burning hayricks. When the town crier of Meaux climbed onto the market cross, his words struck like a torch to tinder. The lords meet tonight to triple the salt tax. Never mind that no such meeting was scheduled, the mere suggestion sent peasants who'd spent a lifetime bent double over their plots, straightening up with scythes in hand. By dawn, the Jacquerie Revolt had begun, its name drawn from the derisive term for rural laborers, Jacques Bonhomme, simple Jack, but there was nothing simple about what followed. Castles went up in flames, noble families were dragged from their beds, and France's already fragile stability collapsed into anarchy. What made this rumor so explosive wasn't just its economic cruelty, it was the context. France had barely recovered from the Black Death, which had wiped out half the workforce. Surviving peasants suddenly held bargaining power, demanding better wages and conditions. The nobility, desperate to maintain their lavish lifestyles, responded with harsh laws fixing wages at pre-plague levels. When the crier spoke of new taxes, he wasn't just predicting hardship, he was confirming the peasants' darkest suspicions that the aristocracy would rather bleed them dry than adapt to a changed world. The rumor didn't create class resentment, it gave it permission to erupt. The Jacquerie's violence was shocking even by medieval standards. At the Château d'Ermenonville, rebels forced a knight to roast his own children before executing him. In Provence, they tore apart tax ledgers with their teeth. These weren't just attacks on people, they were assaults on the very symbols of oppression. Castles as monuments to inequality, account books as records of exploitation. The crier's lie had turned economic grievance into holy war, with pitchforks as crusader swords. Yet the revolt's aftermath proved even more revealing. Within weeks, the peasant army was crushed by noble forces, its leaders impaled along roadside gibbets, but the damage to France's war effort against England was irreversible. With the countryside in chaos, supply lines faltered, and garrisons were recalled to put down rebellions rather than fight the enemy. King John II, already captive in London after the Battle of Poitiers, found his ransom negotiations stalling as his kingdom disintegrated. The rumor hadn't just cost lives, it had cost France the momentum in the 100 Years' War, buying England precious time to consolidate its holdings. This night also exposes the double-edged sword of economic misinformation. Unlike rumors about royal deaths or military betrayals, which fade once disproven, tax lies leave lasting scars. Long after the Jacquerie was suppressed, French peasants continued hiding harvests and underreporting livestock, convinced the next crushing levy was just one crier's announcement away. The trust between rulers and ruled never fully healed, a lesson that echoes in every modern protest over austerity measures or wealth inequality. Now turn northeast to the frozen marshes of Prussia, where a very different kind of rumor would unravel not a kingdom but a holy order. Because when a Teutonic knight's drunken boast about secret pagan alliances reached the wrong ears, it wouldn't just start a war, it would end the era of crusader states in the Baltic forever. The forest of Grunwald was eerily silent on that July night in 1410, the usual clatter of armor and horses stilled by an unsettling whisper slithering through the Teutonic knights' camp. Just hours before the decisive battle against Polish-Lithuanian forces, a town crier's voice sliced through the tension with a claim that turned seasoned warriors pale. The Hungarian reinforcements have turned back. The Livonian brothers abandon us. Neither assertion held truth. King Sigismund's troops were merely delayed, and the Livonian Order's banners still flew nearby. But in the fog of pre-battle nerves, the rumor didn't need facts to fester. What made this deception so devastating was how it exploited the knights' deepest vulnerability, their identity as a brotherhood. The Teutonic Order wasn't just an army, it was a sacred fraternity bound by vows. The suggestion that their allies, especially fellow crusaders, would break faith struck at the very heart of their unity. Commanders wasted precious hours sending scouts to verify the claims, disrupting carefully laid battle formations. When the Polish-Lithuanian forces attacked at dawn, entire flanks of the Teutonic army were still scrambling to reposition, their cohesion shattered long before the first arrow flew. The rumor's timing was surgical. Medieval battles hinged on morale as much as tactics, and the crier's words didn't just sow doubt, they rewired the knights' perception of the coming fight. Where once they'd envisioned a holy victory, now they saw betrayal. That shift mattered profoundly in an era when soldiers believed divine favor decided battles. The psychological blow was as crippling as any physical ambush. By the time Grand Master Ulrich von Jungingen led his famous cavalry charge, his men were already braced for defeat, a self-fulfilling prophecy etched into their minds by a single knight's whisper. Historians still debate whether the crier was a Polish agent or merely repeating campfire gossip, but the aftermath speaks volumes. The Teutonic Order lost not just the battle but nearly its entire leadership, with von Jungingen and 200 knights slaughtered on the field. Grunwald marked the end of their Baltic dominance, proving that even the most disciplined warriors weren't immune to the virus of misinformation. Now, shift your gaze southeast to Baghdad in 1258, where a different kind of rumor, not of abandoned allies, but of hidden weakness, would seal the fate of an empire 8 centuries old. Because when a crier declared the Abbasid Caliph had secretly fled his own capital, he wasn't just spreading fear, he was handing the Mongols the keys to the city. The Tigris River ran black with ink on that fateful January night in 1258, not from pollution, but from the countless books tossed into its waters as Baghdad burned. Amid the chaos, one sound cut through the screams of fleeing scholars, a town crier's voice roar with panic, declaring the unthinkable. The Caliph has abandoned us. The palace stands empty. The lie spread faster than the Mongols' advancing torches. By dawn, defenders at the eastern gates were tossing down their weapons, convinced resistance was futile without their spiritual leader. In truth, Caliph al-Mustasim was still huddled in his treasury, desperately trying to buy mercy from Hulagu Khan with gold that would soon be meaningless. What made this rumor so catastrophic was how it targeted the very soul of Baghdad's defense. The Abbasid Caliph wasn't just a ruler, he was the shadow of God on earth, the living thread connecting the city to divine protection. To suggest he'd fled wasn't merely reporting cowardice, it implied Allah himself had withdrawn favor. Guards who'd held their posts through weeks of bombardment now questioned whether their sacrifice had ever been blessed. The psychological unraveling was instantaneous. Gates left unbarred, siege engines unmanned, and whole companies of soldiers melting into the alleys, not because the walls had fallen, but because the idea holding them up had collapsed. The Mongols understood something modern armies often forget. The strongest fortifications are made of faith, not stone. Hulagu's spies had spent weeks seeding doubts about the caliph's leadership, whispering about his indecision, his lavish banquets while rations dwindled. The Criers' announcement didn't introduce new fears. It crystallized existing ones into a single, shattering narrative. When the Western Gate finally fell, it wasn't breached by battering rams, it was opened from within by defenders who'd convinced themselves they were already doomed. The aftermath rewrote history. Baghdad's House of Wisdom, home to centuries of scientific and philosophical knowledge, burned for 7 days. The Tigris's Inkai waters became a metaphor for the dark ages that followed. But the most enduring lesson lay in the rumor's aftermath. Al-Mustasim was captured alive, rolled in a carpet, and trampled by Mongol horses, a death reserved for those whose blood couldn't be spilled ceremonially. The cruel irony, his subjects died believing he'd escaped. Their last moments were spent cursing a betrayal that never happened, while the man they thought had fled was actually marching toward a far grimmer fate. Now fast forward 6 decades to a very different kind of siege. One waged not with swords but with scripture, because when a crier in Constance declared the Catholic Church had 3 popes simultaneously, it wouldn't just weaken an institution. It would prove that even God's chosen representatives weren't immune to the poison of a well-timed lie. The cobbled streets of Avignon echoed with gasps on that humid September night in 1378, as a town crier's proclamation ripped through the gathering crowd. By decree of His Holiness Clement VII, the Roman pretender is anathema. The words weren't just an announcement, they were a declaration of war between 2 men both claiming to be God's vicar on earth. With that single cry, the great schism of the West erupted in full force, splitting Christendom into rival camps and turning faith itself into a battleground. What made this night so explosive wasn't just the schism's existence, it was how the rumor weaponized geography. For 70 years, the papacy had resided in Avignon under French influence, a Babylonian captivity that left Rome crumbling. When Pope Gregory XI finally returned the Holy See to Italy, his death sparked chaos. Roman crowds demanded an Italian pope, electing Urban VI, whose harsh reforms alienated French cardinals. They fled back to Avignon, electing Clement VII instead. The crier's cry didn't create the divide, it made it irrevocable, transforming a messy election dispute into a holy crisis of legitimacy. Now, every baptized Christian faced an impossible choice: which pope's blessings were valid, which sacraments would damn them. The rumor's genius lay in its framing. By branding Urban a pretender, the Avignon crier didn't just question his election, he painted Rome itself as spiritually contaminated. Suddenly, pilgrimages to St. Peter's Basilica became acts of heresy in Avignon's eyes. Priests ordained by Urban were declared frauds, their masses void. The ripple effects were catastrophic. In German villages, two priests might arrive, one from each pope demanding tithes while denouncing the other as Satan's agent. Kings exploited the chaos, pledging allegiance to whichever pope suited their politics. France backed Avignon. England, locked in the 100 Years' War, defiantly recognized Rome. The Church's universal authority, already strained by plague and peasant revolts, now fractured along national lines. Yet the schism's deepest damage was psychological. For generations, the Church had been the one unshakable pillar in a chaotic world. Now, even God's house seemed divided against itself. In Siena, frescoes of the Last Judgment were hastily repainted to show two competing popes at heaven's gates. In Paris, theology students debated whether salvation required knowing which pope was really Christ's successor. The Criers' words hadn't just created administrative chaos, they'd sown existential doubt. If the Church couldn't agree on its own leader, how could it claim to hold the keys to eternity? The schism dragged on for 39 years, resolved only when a council deposed both rival popes and elected a compromise candidate, but the scars remained. The spectacle of competing papacies had emboldened reformers like John Wycliffe and Jan Hus, whose critiques of church corruption would later ignite the Protestant Reformation. More immediately, it taught European powers a dangerous lesson: that spiritual authority could be manipulated like any other political tool. Now, turn your gaze south to the arid plains of Castile, where a different kind of holy rumor was about to reshape a continent's destiny. Because when a crier in Granada shouted that the emir had secretly promised tribute to the Ottomans, he wasn't just spreading gossip, he was handing Ferdinand and Isabella the perfect excuse to finish what 8 centuries of Reconquista had begun. The Alhambra's red walls glowed like embers in the torchlight that January night in 1492, as a voice rang through Granada's winding streets with a lie that would echo through history: the Sultan bargains with the Christians. The gates opened by dawn. The accusation struck like a scimitar to the spine of the last Muslim stronghold in Iberia. Never mind that Boabdil was still in his palace, desperately negotiating terms with Ferdinand and Isabella. The rumor didn't need truth. It needed only to fracture what little resolve remained among a population exhausted by years of siege and starvation. What made this deception so devastating was its surgical precision. Granada had held out for nearly a decade, its mountainous defenses and sophisticated systems allowing it to resist where other cities had fallen. But the Criers' cry didn't target military strategy. It eroded the one thing keeping resistance alive: the belief that their leader still fought for them. When merchants near the Barambla Gate began packing their wares that night, it wasn't fear of Castilian swords that moved them. It was the crushing certainty that even their sultan had abandoned the cause. By sunrise, whole neighborhoods stood empty, their inhabitants fleeing to the Alpujarras hills rather than face what they assumed was imminent betrayal. The rumor's timing was fiendishly strategic. Boabdil's reign had always been fractious, his authority undermined by rival factions within the Nasrid court. The Criers' words didn't invent dissent. They amplified whispers already circulating among those who blamed the young sultan for provoking the Christian onslaught. And in that climate of suspicion, the lie became unstoppable. Defenders at the Torre de la Vella lowered their weapons, convinced their watch had become pointless. Tax collectors burned records, fearing they'd soon answer to new masters. The rumor didn't just spread, it rewired reality, making surrender feel inevitable long before the actual terms were signed. Yet the real tragedy lay in the aftermath. When Boabdil finally did relinquish the keys to the city on January 2nd, the moment was anticlimactic, a formality following weeks of quiet negotiations. The Sultan's famous tears as he left the Alhambra, "You weep like a woman for what you could not defend as a man." his mother allegedly scolded weren't for a sudden defeat, but for a prolonged collapse accelerated by that one night's lie. Granada's fall didn't just mark the end of Al-Andalus. It demonstrated how easily centuries of civilization could unravel when people stopped believing in their own story. Now shift your gaze north to the fog-draped wharves of Lübeck in 1534, where a different kind of rumor, not about surrender, but about salted herring, would strike the death blow to a commercial empire that had dominated northern Europe for 400 years. Because when a Hanseatic crier declared their rivals had poisoned the Baltic fish stocks, he wasn't just spreading panic, he was handing the Dutch and English the keys to the North Sea. The chill Baltic wind carried more than the scent of salted herring through Lübeck streets that winter night in 1367. It carried an accusation sharp enough to slice through centuries of trust. When the town crier's voice cracked across the marketplace, his words weren't just news, they were a blade aimed at the heart of the Hanseatic League itself. The Bruges merchants hoard our silver. The Danes cheat the scales. In an instant, the delicate web of reciprocity holding Northern Europe's greatest trade alliance together began to unravel. What made this rumor so lethal was its surgical precision. The Hanseatic League wasn't just a coalition, it was a brotherhood bound by oaths, where Lübeck's word held the same weight as Riga's or Novgorod's. The crier didn't accuse outsiders of treachery, he turned Hanseatic cities against each other, weaponizing the quiet resentments that had festered for generations. Bruges, with its privileged access to English wool, had long been envied. Danish control of the Øresund Strait rankled those forced to pay tolls. The crier's genius lay in framing these grievances not as natural tensions, but as proof of systemic betrayal. By dawn, Lübeck's merchants were locking their warehouses, refusing to honor debts to cheats they'd traded with for decades. The economic fallout was immediate. Within weeks, the League's famous contour trading posts, those neutral grounds where deals were once sealed with handshakes, became armed camps. Bergen's German quarter expelled Hanseatic inspectors, convinced their ledgers were being falsified. In London, the steelyard merchants split into factions, some refusing to sell Baltic timber to thieves in Rostock. The rumor hadn't just sown discord, it had rewritten the rules of engagement. Where once a merchant's word was his bond, now every contract needed notaries, every shipment required armed guards. The cost of doing business skyrocketed, and with it, the price of everything from Flemish cloth to Russian furs. Yet the true devastation was psychological. The Hanseatic League had thrived because its members truly believed, in collective strength. A Lübeck shipwrecked off Gotland knew fellow Hansa merchants would salvage its cargo. A debt deferred in Tallinn could be called in years later in Bruges. That unshakable faith was the League's real currency, more valuable than any silver mark. The crier's lie didn't just damage trust, it revealed how fragile that trust had always been. Like a wine cask tapped at the seams, the alliance didn't explode, it slowly drained away, leaving behind empty husks of what were once the richest ports in Europe. Historians still debate whether the crier acted alone. Some whisper of English wool merchants bribing him to weaken their Hanseatic rivals. Others point to the Danish crown, eager to fracture the League's control over Baltic trade routes. But the aftermath speaks for itself. Within a generation, the Dutch and English would bypass Hanseatic middlemen entirely, sailing directly to the Baltic. The League's decline wasn't caused by cannons or blockades, but by something far more insidious. The moment its members stopped seeing allies in each other's eyes and saw only thieves. Now turn your gaze west to the misty highlands of Scotland, where a different kind of betrayal was brewing, one that wouldn't target merchants, but a king himself. Because when a crier in Edinburgh declared James III had signed a secret pact with England, he wasn't just spreading gossip. He was handing the Scottish nobility the rope to hang their monarch with. The mud of Socherburn Field clung to boots and blades alike on that grey June morning in 1488, as the king's own standard-bearer turned his mount and galloped toward rebel lines, his defection sealed by a rumour shouted through Edinburgh's streets just nights before. The king's axe thirsts for noble blood, the crier had declared, his voice bouncing off the steep closes. By Michaelmas, a dozen heads will roll. The claim was baseless. James III had no such execution orders, but in the simmering tension between Scotland's paranoid monarch and his restive barons, the lie didn't need proof. It needed only to confirm what the nobles already feared. What made this rumor so explosive wasn't just its brutality, but its brilliant exploitation of James's reputation. The king had spent years alienating his aristocracy, favoring low-born advisors like his tailor Robert Cochrane over ancient families like the Douglases and Hepburns. When the crier spoke of impending executions, he wasn't inventing outrage, he was giving shape to the nobles' deepest suspicions, that the list allegedly included the Earl of Angus and Lord Home. A masterstroke, these weren't just powerful men, they were the very lords guarding the southern marches against England. The rumor framed James not merely as cruel, but as a monarch willing to gut Scotland's defences for personal vendettas. The rebellion unfolded with terrifying speed. Within days, disaffected lords rallied around James's 15-year-old son, the future James IV, presenting the conflict as a choice between a mad king and Scotland's survival. By the time the armies clashed at Socherburn, the king's forces were already riddled with defectors, men who'd fought alongside him weeks earlier, but now believed the crier's warning that their names might be next on the phantom execution list. When James fled the field and sought refuge in a miller's cottage, his assassins found him not because of some grand betrayal, but because the miller himself, convinced the king was a tyrant, revealed his hiding place. The aftermath revealed the rumor's most insidious effect. With James dead and his son crowned, Scotland didn't unite under new leadership, it fractured further. The same lords who'd rebelled against the father now jockeyed to control the boy king, plunging the realm into decades of instability. The crier's lie hadn't just toppled a monarch, it had shattered the fragile trust binding Scotland's feudal system. From that night forward, every Stuart ruler would govern with one eye on the nobles and another on the town criers, knowing how easily a whispered accusation could become a death warrant. Now shift your gaze south to the glittering court of Burgundy in 1477, where a very different kind of rumor, not about executions but adultery, would doom the last great medieval duchy. Because when a crier in Dijon declared Duchess Mary had taken a lover, he wasn't just tarnishing her reputation. He was handing Louis XI of France the perfect pretext to dismantle an empire. The snow outside Nancy was stained crimson on that bitter January night in 1477, not just from battle but from the chaos of a lie. As Charles the Bold's Burgundian forces clashed with the Swiss, a town crier's voice suddenly pierced the din. "The Duke is slain, flee for your lives." The words spread like wildfire through the ranks, never mind that Charles still sat astride his warhorse, very much alive. In the fog of war, perception outpaced reality. Soldiers dropped their pikes and ran, creating gaps in the line that Swiss halberdiers exploited with brutal efficiency. By the time Charles realized his army was crumbling around him, it was too late. Isolated and overwhelmed, the last great Duke of Burgundy met his end not because of any mortal wound, but because his men believed he'd already fallen. What makes this night so haunting isn't just the irony, a false report of death becoming a self-fulfilling prophecy, but how it exposed the fragility of medieval command structures. Charles's forces were a patchwork of mercenaries and feudal levies, held together by personal loyalty to their formidable leader. The moment that figurehead seemed gone, the army's cohesion evaporated. The rumor didn't just misinform, it severed the psychological tether keeping men in formation. Swiss chroniclers later wrote of Burgundian knights trampling their own foot soldiers in their panic, their flight more destructive than enemy blades. The aftermath rewrote Europe's map. With Charles dead and no male heir, the sprawling Burgundian state, a realm that had rivaled kingdoms in wealth and influence, was carved up between France and the Habsburgs. Cities like Bruges and Ghent, once thriving under Burgundian patronage, dwindled into provincial backwaters, but the deeper lesson lay in the rumor's origin. Some historians suspect the crier was a Swiss plant, exploiting the Burgundians' dependence on shouted orders in the din of battle. Others argue it was a terrified squire misidentifying a fallen noble. Either way, the power of the lie lay in its plausibility. Charles had been wounded in previous battles, and his aggressive tactics made his death seem inevitable. This night also reveals a brutal truth about information warfare. The Swiss didn't need superior numbers or technology to defeat the famed Burgundian cavalry. They just needed to weaponize uncertainty. 5 centuries before fake news became a phrase, Nancy proved that in battle, perception could be deadlier than steel. Now, turn the clock back nearly 2 centuries to another fateful rumor, one that wouldn't topple a duke, but an order of warrior monks revered across Christendom. Because when a crier in Paris declared the Knights Templar had spit on the cross, he wasn't just slandering individuals, he was handing a cash-strapped king the perfect excuse to destroy the medieval world's most powerful bank. The cobblestones of Paris were slick with autumn rain on that October night in 1307, but nothing chilled the bones like the town crier's words echoing off the walls of the temple precinct. By order of His Majesty King Philip, the Templars stand accused of heresy of spitting on the cross and worshipping demons in the dark. The proclamation wasn't just an accusation, it was the opening salvo in a meticulously orchestrated strike against the most powerful military order in Christendom. By dawn, every Templar in France would be in chains, their vast treasury seized, their legacy rewritten in the ink of scandal. What made this rumor so devastating wasn't its creativity, it was its surgical exploitation of medieval piety. The Templars weren't just knights, they were living symbols of crusading virtue, their white mantles emblazoned with the red cross a testament to their sacred duty. To accuse them of heresy wasn't merely slander, it inverted the very foundation of their existence. The crier's words didn't just shock Paris, they weaponized the deepest fears of a society where salvation hung on orthodoxy. When he described Templars allegedly renouncing Christ during initiation rites, he wasn't reporting gossip, he was holding a mirror to the era's terror of hidden corruption. The speed of the crackdown revealed how thoroughly Philip the Fair had prepared his trap. Templar preceptories across France were raided simultaneously, their members arrested before they could muster a defense. The king's agents even intercepted messengers rushing to warn distant commanderies, ensuring the rumor spread faster than the truth. And here's the cruel twist. Many of the confessions extracted under torture echoed the crier's exact phrasing, as if pain could turn fiction into fact. Grand Master Jacques de Molay's eventual retraction shouted from the pyre as flames consumed him came too late. The order was already ashes, but the real brilliance of Philip's scheme lay in its financial engineering. The Templars weren't just warriors, they were Europe's first international bankers, safeguarding royal treasuries and issuing letters of credit that spanned continents. By destroying them, Philip didn't just eliminate a rival power, he cancelled his crushing debts to them with a single stroke of the pen. The rumor didn't just tarnish reputations, it became the ultimate debt relief strategy, proving that in the right hands, slander could balance ledgers as effectively as any audit. The aftermath reshaped medieval Europe. Without the Templars' networks, kings turned to rising Italian banking houses, accelerating the rise of the Medici and other financiers. The Church, complicit in the purge, saw its moral authority erode as whispers spread about collusion with Philip's greed. Yet most haunting of all was the template it established, how easily faith could be weaponized against the faithful. When Martin Luther nailed his theses to Wittenberg's door 2 centuries later, he'd be channeling the same skepticism the Templar affair had sown, that institutions claiming divine sanction might just be protecting earthly power. Now, cross continents and centuries to the bustling streets of Beijing in 1644, where a very different rumor, not of heresy but of a missing emperor, would ignite the flame that burned down the Ming Dynasty. Because when a crier declared the Chongzhen emperor had fled the Forbidden City, he wasn't just spreading panic, he was handing rebel armies the key to the empire's throat. The drums of rebellion thundered outside Beijing's walls on that fateful April night in 1644, but it was a whisper inside the Forbidden City that sealed the Ming Dynasty's doom. As Lai Zicheng's peasant army massed beyond the gates, a town crier's shrill voice pierced the palace corridors with an accusation more lethal than any arrow. The eunuchs conspire with the rebels. The gates stand unbarred. The claim was absurd. Beijing's massive walls remained secured by loyal guards, yet in the feverish atmosphere of a crumbling court, the lie didn't need plausibility. It needed only to confirm the emperor's deepest paranoia about the very men who controlled his inner sanctum. What made this rumor so catastrophic was its deliberate targeting of the Ming's most vulnerable nerve. For centuries, eunuchs had been the dynasty's shadow government, managing everything from tax collection to military logistics. Their access to the emperor made them indispensable and deeply resented by scholar officials who saw them as upstart meddlers. The crier's cry didn't invent this tension. It poured salt into a festering wound. Within hours, Chongzhen Emperor ordered the arrest of dozens of high-ranking eunuchs, including the powerful director of ceremonial Wang Chenjin. As interrogations began, critical chains of command snapped. Orders to reinforce city gates went unsigned. Requests for artillery placements vanished in bureaucratic limbo. The rumor hadn't just sown discord, it had paralyzed the machinery of defense at the precise moment it was needed most. The timing was diabolical. Lai Zicheng's forces had been besieging Beijing for weeks, their assaults repelled by the city's formidable defenses. But as the emperor wasted precious hours rooting out imagined traitors, real vulnerabilities emerged. Guards at the Xingyang gate, demoralized by rumors of their eunuch commander's treachery, abandoned their posts to loot grain warehouses. By dawn, rebels streamed through the undefended passage, not because gates had been opened for them, but because the men who should have been guarding them were either in chains or fleeing the emperor's wrath. When Chongzhen realized his error, it was too late. His final act, hanging himself from a tree behind the Forbidden City, wasn't just personal despair, it was the logical endpoint of a night where perception had overrun reality. This night also exposes the lethal paradox of imperial power. The Ming system had deliberately made eunuchs both omnipresent and expendable, granting them authority while denying them the legitimacy to defend themselves against accusations. When the crier's words flew, the eunuchs had no allies among the scholar class eager to see them fall, nor among the military who resented their oversight. Their very isolation, the quality that made them perfect servants of the throne, became the dynasty's undoing. A government that relied on whispers could not survive when those whispers turned toxic. Now shift your gaze westward to the German countryside in 1524, where a different kind of rumor, not about courtly betrayal, but about a pastor's radical sermon, would ignite the greatest popular uprising Europe had ever seen. Because when a crier in the Black Forest declared that Luther's teachings justified refusing tithes to the church, he wasn't just spreading theology. He was handing peasant armies their battle cry. The spring air over Memmingen smelled of damp earth and rebellion on that chilly March night in 1525, as a town crier's voice sliced through the gathering dark with a lie that would drown Germany in blood. "Luther stands with us," he shouted, waving a parchment that bore neither the reformer's name nor his seal. "The 12 Articles are blessed by God's own prophet." The claim spread like wildfire through the peasant camps, never mind that Luther had cautiously distanced himself from their demands for an end to serfdom and unfair tithes. In that moment, the crier didn't just misrepresent theology. He lit the fuse on Europe's most explosive class war. What made this deception so incendiary wasn't just its falseness. It was how perfectly it exploited the peasants' desperate hope for divine validation. The 12 Articles themselves were a remarkable document, blending biblical arguments with practical grievances like the right to hunt and fish. But when the crier framed them as Luther's personal manifesto, he transformed a protest into a holy crusade. Illiterate field hands who'd never held a pike now marched under banners embroidered with "What God Wills," convinced the great reformer marched beside them in spirit. Their enemies, lords and bishops alike, saw not petitioners but heretics. The line between social reform and revolution blurred overnight. Luther's horrified reaction revealed the rumor's poisonous genius. When he finally denounced the uprising in his pamphlet against the murderous, thieving hordes of peasants, his words dripped with betrayed fury. The crier's lie had forced his hand, making his moderate reforms appear radical and his calls for peace seem hypocritical. The princes needed no further excuse. Their retaliation was swift and savage. Over 100,000 peasants slaughtered in battles like Frankenhausen, where artillery cut down men still clutching their Bibles. The aftermath didn't just crush a rebellion. It severed the bond between Luther's movement and the common people who'd first embraced it. Yet the real tragedy lay in the distortion of the Articles themselves. Buried beneath the carnage was a blueprint for equitable feudalism, ideas about fair rents and communal forests that wouldn't resurface for centuries. The crier's lie didn't just weaponize Luther's name. It ensured these reasonable demands would be remembered only as the rallying cry of a failed revolt. Germany's ruling class, now wary of any scripture-quoting commoner, tightened serfdom in regions where it had been waning. The Reformation, once a unifying force, became yet another tool of division. Now shift your gaze south to the labyrinthine canals of Venice in 1509, where a very different kind of rumor, not of religious fervor but of stolen secrets, would prove even merchant princes weren't immune to the dagger of misinformation. Because when a crier in the Rialto declared the Republic's glassmakers had betrayed their craft to the French, he wasn't just threatening an industry. He was striking at the heart of Venetian identity. The canals of Venice lay eerily still on that suffocating July night in 1576, their usual shimmer replaced by the dull reflection of boarded-up windows. Then, cutting through the silence like a gondolier's knife, a town crier's voice echoed across the empty Piazza San Marco with words that would haunt the Republic for centuries: 20,000 dead. The lazaretto overflows. The numbers were inflated. The plague's true toll was barely half that, but in a city already thick with fear, the lie didn't need accuracy. It needed only to confirm what every merchant and noble already suspected, that Venice's famed defenses against disease had failed utterly. What made this night so catastrophic wasn't just the panic, it was the exodus that followed. Within days, ship manifests read like a who's who of Venetian commerce. The Dandolo family fleeing to their country estates, the Grimani bankers relocating to Padua, even the glassmakers of Murano smuggling their secret formulas to makeshift furnaces on the mainland. The Criers' exaggeration didn't just spread fear, it triggered an economic hemorrhage. With skilled laborers gone, the arsenal's shipyards fell idle. Markets that had buzzed with Levantine spices stood deserted. Even the once unthinkable happened. The Rialto exchange suspended trading for the first time in living memory. Venice didn't just lose people that night, it lost the critical mass that made its economy hum. The rumor's timing was diabolically precise. For generations, Venice had prided itself on its rigorous public health measures. The first Lazaretto quarantine islands, the meticulous burning of plague victims' belongings. But 1576's outbreak arrived via a single infected sailor who'd slipped through the net, undermining faith in the system. When the crier shouted his inflated numbers, he wasn't just reporting deaths, he was declaring the Republic's medical prowess a myth. The psychological blow was as devastating as the disease itself. Historians still debate whether the crier acted alone or was pressured by city officials desperate to justify extreme measures. But the aftermath speaks volumes. Though the plague eventually receded, Venice never regained its position as Europe's trade hub. The Dutch and English, seizing the moment, established direct routes to the East Indies, bypassing Venetian middlemen. The Republic's once unrivaled navy dwindled as shipbuilding knowledge scattered with fleeing artisans. Even the Carnival, that symbol of Venetian resilience, was suspended for years, its masks now associated not with revelry, but with hiding plague sores. This night also reveals a brutal truth about economic contagion. Unlike wars or sieges which leave visible scars, the damage wrought by health rumors is insidious. The value of Venetian real estate didn't collapse because of fire or bombardment, but because trust had evaporated. A merchant house might still stand intact, but if no one believed it was safe to enter, it might as well have been rubble. The plague itself killed thousands, but the rumor of its reach killed a city's future. Now turn your gaze north to the icy waters of the Øresund in 1523, where a very different kind of rumor, not about disease, but about a king's drowning, would shatter the Nordic world. Because when a crier in Copenhagen declared Christian II had been lost at sea, he wasn't just mourning a monarch, he was handing Sweden the knife to sever the Kalmar Union forever. The snow in Stockholm's Stortorget Square turned crimson on that frigid November night in 1520, not from fresh snowfall, but from the blood of nobles who'd trusted a lie. Just days earlier, a town crier's voice had rung out with what seemed like merciful news. By King Christian's decree, all Swedish lords who swear fealty shall receive full pardon. The promise was a masterpiece of deception. Nearly 100 aristocrats, bishops, knights, even elderly statesmen emerged from hiding to kneel before the Danish king, only to find themselves shackled and dragged to the execution block instead. The axe fell for 3 days straight, turning what was meant to be a coronation feast into the massacre history remembers as the Stockholm Bloodbath. What made this betrayal so devastating wasn't just its brutality, it was how meticulously it exploited the rules of medieval diplomacy. Christian II had every reason to offer clemency. Sweden had been a restless part of the Kalmar Union for over a century, and executing its elite risked permanent rebellion. The crier's proclamation didn't just sound believable, it sounded strategically wise. That's why so many fell for it. The nobles weren't naive. They were calculating the odds, weighing the benefits of surrender against the cost of continued resistance. The lie worked because it gave them exactly what their political instincts demanded: a face-saving exit. But Christian's true motives reveal the darker genius of the scheme. By luring his enemies into the open under false pretenses, he didn't just eliminate individual rivals, he shattered the entire machinery of Swedish governance. With one stroke, or rather 100, he decapitated the noble families who might have organized resistance, scattered their allies, and left the peasantry leaderless. The Criers' words hadn't just deceived, they dismantled a nation's spine. Yet the aftermath proved just how catastrophically this kind of dishonesty could backfire. Far from cowing Sweden into submission, the bloodbath birthed a legend that would fuel independence for generations. Among the few who escaped was a young noble named Gustav Vasa, whose father had been among the executed. His flight through the snowy Dalarna forests, pursued by Danish mercenaries, became the stuff of national myth. Within 3 years, he'd rally enough support to storm Stockholm and crown himself king, founding the dynasty that would finally break the Kalmar Union for good. This night also exposes a brutal truth about the psychology of betrayal. The nobles hadn't just been killed, they'd been made complicit in their own demise, tricked into walking willingly to the scaffold. That added humiliation burned deeper than any battlefield loss. When Gustav later commissioned portraits of the massacre, he made sure to show the victims bareheaded and kneeling, their dignity stripped away twice over, first by the axe, then by the memory of how easily they'd been fooled. Now turn the clock back 3 centuries to a crumbling empire where a very different kind of rumor, not about pardons but about poisoned wine, would doom a dynasty that once ruled from Scotland to the Pyrenees. Because when a crier in Chinon declared that Elena of Aquitaine had conspired to murder her own husband, he wasn't just slandering a queen. He was handing the French king the perfect excuse to dismantle the Angevin Empire piece by piece. The marshlands of eastern England shimmered under a harvest moon in October 1216, the reeds whispering secrets the king's men couldn't decipher. Then, cutting through the damp night air, a town crier's voice boomed across the Lincolnshire fens with news that would unravel an empire. King John lies cold at Newark. The crown passes to none. The proclamation spread like floodwater breaching a dike. Never mind that John was very much alive, nursing dysentery in a drafty castle chamber 30 miles away. By dawn, Norman barons who'd spent a decade chafing under his rule were already sharpening quills to draft letters of allegiance to Prince Louis of France, while mercenaries in John's own employ began deserting, convinced their paymaster's gold was now worthless. What made this rumor so lethal wasn't just its timing. It was how perfectly it exploited the fractures John had spent his reign creating. The Angevin Empire, that sprawling dominion stretching from the Scottish borders to the Pyrenees, had always been held together by a precarious mix of feudal oaths and brute force. When the crier declared John dead, he didn't just announce a vacancy on the throne, he exposed the lie at the heart of the system. Barons in Aquitaine who'd endured John's heavy taxes for the defense of the realm now saw no reason to pay. Welsh princes who'd grudgingly accepted his overlordship sensed an opening to reclaim lost lands. Even London's merchants, normally cautious, began stocking warehouses with French wine in anticipation of Louis's arrival. The rumor didn't just spread, it revealed how thin the veneer of loyalty really was. John's desperate attempts to disprove his own death bordered on farce. He staged public appearances at Newark's gates, waving to crowds that had already dispersed. He ordered church bells rung in celebration of his survival, only for the sound to be misinterpreted as funeral tolls in neighboring villages. The harder he fought the lie, the more it mutated. By the time he succumbed to his illness for real just days later, the damage was irreversible. His 9-year-old son Henry would inherit the crown, but not the empire. Normandy, Anjou, and Poitou were already slipping away like sand through a child's fingers, their nobles having used the rumor's chaos to quietly switch allegiances. This night also reveals a brutal truth about medieval power. Legitimacy wasn't just about bloodlines or battle prowess, it depended on the constant performance of authority. The moment people believed the performance had ended, the throne itself became fiction. John's actual death weeks later was almost an afterthought. The kingdom had already mourned him. And in that gap between perceived and real power, dynasties crumbled. Yet the most enduring lesson lies in the aftermath. The Magna Carta John had been forced to sign the previous year, a document he'd treated as a temporary inconvenience, became the foundation of English law precisely because the barons no longer trusted kings to rule without constraints. The Criers' lie hadn't just toppled a monarch, it had rewritten the social contract, proving that even the mightiest empire was only as strong as the stories holding it together. And with that, our 21 nights draw to a close, not with a single cataclysm, but with a whisper that echoed across centuries. Because whether in Constantinople or Lincolnshire, the pattern holds: empires don't fall to invaders alone. They fall when the voices meant to bind them together instead become the hammers that break them apart. From Constantinople to the Angevin Empire, these 21 nights reveal a chilling truth. The right words, whispered at the right moment, could topple thrones faster than any army. Town criers, those walking paradoxes of authority and vulnerability, stood at the crossroads of history, their voices shaping destinies with every proclamation. They were the medieval internet, the original viral vectors, carrying messages that could unite kingdoms or unravel them stitch by stitch. And the most dangerous messages weren't always lies. Sometimes they were truths distorted by fear, half heard and half understood, mutating as they traveled from mouth to ear until reality itself bent under their weight. Consider how little has changed. Today, algorithms replace town criers, and social media platforms serve as our digital market squares. But the human instinct to believe, especially when the news is dire, sensational, or confirms our deepest suspicions, remains unchanged. A medieval peasant clutching a rosary as the crier announced the Pope's death wasn't so different from a modern reader refreshing a news feed, desperate for confirmation of some shocking headline. The mechanisms have evolved, but the vulnerabilities endure. We still crave narratives that explain chaos, even when those narratives are spun from shadows. There's a reason these stories resonate. They're not just about the past, they're mirrors held up to our own age of misinformation. The same forces that made a 14th century merchant abandon his stall at rumors of plague now make us stockpile goods during a supply chain panic. The whispers that turned allies into enemies during the Mongol Civil War still divide communities today, substituting medieval battle lines for political ones. History doesn't repeat, but it rhymes, and the cadence of those rhymes is set by human nature itself. So what's the antidote? Vigilance, yes, but also humility. Every empire in these tales collapsed in part because its leaders believed their own myths too deeply. They assumed loyalty was unshakable, that their people would dismiss wild claims, that the system was too robust to fail. And every time they underestimated how quickly trust, that invisible mortar holding societies together, could dissolve. The lesson isn't just to fact-check, it's to recognize that no institution, no matter how ancient or revered, is immune to the toxin of distrust once it seeps into the well. As we close this chapter, I'd love to hear which of these whispered turning points struck you most. Was it the doomed Templars trapped by their own reputation, The frantic Ming emperor unraveling his dynasty by suspecting traitors everywhere, or perhaps the Burgundian duke whose army fled a death that hadn't happened yet. Drop your thoughts below. Let's keep unraveling history's tangled threads together. And if you enjoyed this journey through the knights that reshaped the world, don't forget to like, subscribe, and join us next time when we'll explore how a single misdelivered letter sparked a war that lasted 335 years. Until then, remember, the loudest voices aren't always the ones that change history. Sometimes it's the whispers we dare to repeat.